Asylum's Lullaby. In the early 2000s, a group of friends decided to explore an old abandoned asylum on the outskirts of their town. The building, known as the Greystone Sanitarium, had been closed since the 1970s and was rumored to be haunted. Undeterred by the stories, the friends armed themselves with flashlights and a camera, hoping to capture some paranormal activity. As they made their way through the decaying corridors, they encountered eerie graffiti and remnants of the asylum's past, including rusty gurneys and tattered patient records. The air was thick with the smell of mold and rot, and the silence was broken only by their footsteps and the occasional drip of water from the leaky roof. They reached the children's ward, where the walls were adorned with faded murals of cartoon characters. Suddenly they heard a soft, melodic lullaby echoing through the halls. It was faint, but unmistakable. They followed the sound, their hearts pounding, until they reached a room at the end of the hall. Inside, they found an old, dusty music box on a broken dresser, playing the haunting tune. The friends were paralyzed with fear as they watched the box slowly wind down and stop. Just as they were about to leave, one of them noticed a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room. It was a small child, dressed in tattered hospital clothes, staring at them with hollow eyes. Panic set in, and they fled the building, vowing never to return. Later, they researched the asylum's history and discovered that many children had died there due to neglect and abuse. The figure they saw matched the description of a young patient who had mysteriously disappeared years before. To this day, they believe they encountered the restless spirit of that lost child, forever haunting the abandoned asylum. The Haunted Hotel. In the late 1980s, a young couple named Mark and Lisa were traveling across the country when they decided to stop for the night in a small, forgotten town. They found an old, decrepit hotel, the Grand View, which had been closed for decades. Intrigued by its history and seeking an adventure, they decided to spend the night inside. The hotel was a shell of its former self, with broken windows, peeling wallpaper, and dusty furniture. They set up their sleeping bags in the grand ballroom, marveling at the once opulent chandeliers and ornate moldings. As night fell, they explored the building, taking photos and imagining what it must have been like in its heyday. Around midnight, they heard footsteps echoing through the halls. Thinking it might be other explorers or local kids, they called out but received no response. The footsteps grew louder, and doors began to slam shut on their own. Fearful, they decided to return to the ballroom and wait for morning. As they lay in their sleeping bags, they heard faint whispers and saw shadowy figures moving in the darkness. Suddenly, the temperature dropped and a cold breeze swept through the room. Mark felt a hand grip his shoulder, but when he turned, no one was there. Lisa saw a ghostly woman in a long dress standing by the doorway, her face twisted in sorrow. Terrified, they packed up and left the hotel immediately. The next day, they spoke to a local historian who told them that the hotel had been the site of numerous tragic events, including a fire that had killed several guests in the 1920s. The woman they saw matched the description of a bride who had perished in the blaze on her wedding night. Mark and Lisa believe they encountered the spirits of those who died in the fire, forever trapped in the abandoned hotel. Their experience left them shaken and convinced that some places are better left undisturbed. The Factory's Secret. In the winter of 2015, a group of urban explorers decided to investigate an abandoned factory on the edge of town. The old textile mill, once a bustling hub of activity, had been closed for decades and was rumored to be haunted by the spirits of workers who had died in a tragic accident. The explorers entered the building through a broken window, their flashlights cutting through the darkness. The factory was a maze of crumbling machinery, rusted pipes, and decaying walls. As they ventured deeper, they heard strange noises, distant clanking, whispers, and the occasional thud. They reached the factory's basement, where they found a series of locked doors. One of the explorers, Jack, managed to pick the lock on one of the doors, revealing a hidden room. Inside, they discovered old newspapers and documents detailing a horrific incident. A fire had broken out in the factory years ago, trapping and killing several workers. The owner had covered up the tragedy to avoid liability, leaving the victims' families in the dark. As they read through the papers, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread. The room grew colder, and the lights began to flicker. Suddenly, they heard footsteps approaching from the hallway. Jack looked out and saw the apparition of a man in tattered work clothes, his face twisted in pain and anger. The ghostly figure reached out towards him before disappearing into the shadows. Panicking, the group fled the basement and ran out of the factory. They later learned that the man Jack saw was likely the spirit of a worker who had died in the fire, seeking justice for the cover-up. The experience left them haunted by the factory's dark past and the restless souls trapped within its walls.